Everyone, if I could ask you to take your seats at least temporarily, as this is live streamed, we try to start on time. So, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where we're happy, proud, and excited to host the 7th CF40 PIIE joint event in Washington. For a long time now, those of us on the economics side of the world have been wrestling with the fact that we see the world as positive sum, and increasingly others, including a lot of people in both Washington and Beijing, see the world as zero sum or even negative sum. I'm going to make 4 statements that 10 years ago would have been banal, but I now think, unfortunately, are controversial. China and the US face common challenges, starting with economics, but not just economic, and obviously including climate. China and the US can have useful discussions and common understandings on the underlying problems and how best to deal with them. China and the US can help each other without hurting themselves. And most of all, prosperity and stability in both countries are in both people's interest. Again, these are 4 statements that generally would not have been contested and now are. And it's for that reason, at least to serve the first point, that there should be common understanding of our economic challenges, that we are in partnership in an ongoing way with CF40. And we've gathered people here today to update each other, to argue, to clarify, and to, we hope, convene in a constructive way, thinking about the world we live in. And maybe someday we'll get back to a world where those statements are banal again. I want to acknowledge our partnership with CF40, the China Finance 40 Forum. Around the time that I took over as president of Peterson, Dr. Haiming and Wang was founding a new think tank in China. Even with all that has happened since, the CF40 has grown in influence, in stature, and in reach. Their scale now, I believe, far dwarfs the Peterson Institute. Among the many things they do is convene a series of discussions in China and around China, which are notable for their frankness and seriousness in dealing with economic issues. And among other things, they have also created, and it's now, I believe, heading into its 5th year, the Bund Summit, which has become one of the world's most important annual economic events. And so it is with admiration that I want to personally welcome Haiming Wang, the leader and founder of CF40, for keeping us with him on this ride, as this journey, as CF40 continues to expand and make contributions around the world, and we're proud to be a partner. I also want to briefly thank and publicly acknowledge Professor Huang Yiping, Dean of the National School of Development at Peking University. The reason for my saying that is not just because he is distinguished. I think everyone in this room and everyone in this field in the US recognizes him as perhaps the leading macroeconomist as public intellectual in China. But because, like Haiming, he has been a partner to Peterson and our colleagues for 12 years and has kept us on the intellectual substance. And we've been very privileged to host him for a number of talks through the years. And so again, thank you. I apologize, I sound a little throaty today, but the good news is that means I will not talk again and you will hear everybody else. With that, I'd like to ask Carolyn Atkinson to chair the first session. Carolyn is also a distinguished old friend of the Peterson Institute in the Chinese sense of old friend. She is a long-serving member of the Executive Committee of the Institute's Board of Directors, and besides that, has served in a number of critical roles in U.S. foreign economic policy in the highest levels of U.S. government and at the IMF, including as President Obama's G20 G8 Sherpa and Deputy National Security Advisor for Economic Affairs. She knows whereof she speaks. And thank you, Carolyn, for chairing this morning's session. Despite having a carefully prepared schedule, in my brain fog, I got it wrong. Haiming, it is your turn to make remarks. I apologize.
Thank you so much, Adam, for your kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm President of CF40 and the Bund Summit. It's exciting to host the China Economic Forum with PIIE again. I want to say thank you to Adam for your support to our friendship over a decade. Our collaboration is even more important today for our two countries to enhance communication and deal with bilateral and global challenges, trade imbalance and disputes on China's economic policies is also closely watched. These topics have been at the core of our bilateral engagement. Zhang Yellen and Li Shanbo have both led delegations to Beijing to discuss them with us at CF40. And today, we are continuing these dialogues here in DC with PIIE. I look forward to our speakers' views on these critical issues and your suggestions on a brighter path for China-US relationship. Thank you.
Hello, welcome everybody in the room and everybody online. Adam already touched on some of the speakers that we're going to have in this first session, and I'm going to mention all of them and just explain. They will each come in turn and speak from here, and then we'll have a discussion and open for questions there. I think I used to work with, at one point with Larry Summers, and as Adam mentioned, with President Obama, Tom Donilon, who was then very much visited China a lot. And there was agreement that the most important economic relationship for the United States, and maybe for the world, was that with China. I think I share Adam's concern about those four, what seemed to be obvious points a decade ago, no longer being so obvious. And I think it's extremely important to have these kinds of discussions about what in China, I understand, are often called win-win solutions. I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that there are win-win solutions in relationships between these two big countries. It doesn't mean to say that you have to agree on everything. But one of the things that I think is most important, and I think will be interesting in this first discussion, which is about economic and trade relations between the two countries, is how can these be thought of in economic terms, in terms of prosperity and growth and better living standards for our citizens, without getting too confused between economic and national security. I think there's been a sort of blurring of the lines between what are national security issues and what are economic security issues or economic issues. And it's important for us to think about economics, and I still believe that a prosperous and stable China is in the interests of the United States, and a prosperous and stable United States is in the interests of China and our peoples. So I look forward to hearing what people will be talking about now. Adam already mentioned Huang Yiping, and we're very glad to have him speaking here first. He is a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the People's Bank of China, but also, of course, the distinguished professor and dean of the National School of Development, director of the Institute of Digital Finance at Peking University. And we're going to switch between somebody from China and somebody from the United States. The next speaker will be Mary Lovely, the Anthony B. Solomon Senior Fellow at Peterson Institute and colleague. I've very much enjoyed hearing from Mary on issues of China-US relations. Next, there will be Guo Kai, the executive president of CF40 Institute, who used to work at the International Monetary Fund, somewhere that I know well as well, having worked there for a long time, and then at the People's Bank of China. So, and finally, Peterson's own Martin Chorzempa, who many of you know, and is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, having joined and risen rapidly, joined in 2017. He's also knows China well and has worked particularly on financial reforms and other issues. And we look forward to hearing all four of them and then having a discussion. So if I could ask, please, Yiping to begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for your introduction and chairing the session. And I also want to thank Adam for your very kind words. And it's always a great pleasure to be here, to see many old friends, new friends, but also to have exchanges about the critical issues. I'm not really an expert on US-China trade and economic relations. So what I like to do is maybe spend a bit of time to share my, my thoughts, preliminary thoughts about the overcapacity problem in China, especially with regard to the EV as an example. And I like to offer something that we can look at whether or not we can actually make best use of this capacity, which is already built, helping the world. And I was hoping the US and China could do together, but if US has no stomach in the near term, maybe we should think about how to best utilize the capacity. That's my main point. We are, as many of you know, the delegation is spending a week in the US, and this is a very exciting time. I think we heard lots of interesting remarks, predictions, assessment. They're so diverse. I can't even summarize a consensus view at the moment. So, but this is useful for us. So the first thing I like to share with you is it's certain that our trade relations could, I'm not sure if deterioration is the right word, but we're going to see a lot more uncertainties, given that we already start to see messages, policy messages from tweeters, and so there are lots of discussions. What would be the future about the trade and economic relations between the two countries? We have been trying to look through the ways that we could, that the possible future or path of the bilateral relations and what China could do in responding to this new development. So I give a list of the possible actions by China. Now, I don't know which is the more reasonable one, which is less. So I really look forward to hearing other speakers, but also other experts in the room, your assessment and your suggestions. I listed eight possibilities. The first is we could easily fight, or not easily, we could fight a full-blown trade war. That obviously is not in the interest of most people, and certainly not in the interest of China. But that's not impossible. My assessment is the probability is not zero. But if the Trump administration is more concerned about bilateral trade deficit or imbalances, then I think the question when we look at from the Chinese perspective, the big question really is more about macroeconomic imbalance at home. As macroeconomists all would know that the trade or current account deficit is or surplus is the same as saving and investment surplus. The question is, what the problem is, we probably save a bit too much and invest not enough. Then the question is, can we try to realign this relation? Therefore, in the end, you will be able to reduce the external imbalances. The question there is, well, we probably need to boost the domestic consumption. That policy message is very clear. It was reiterated both by the Politburo meeting a couple of days ago and yesterday, the Central Economic Policy Conference. So I think the direction is there, the willingness is here. The question is, how do we make it work? That's, I think, something. It's more about the domestic policy challenge, but if we can make progress, I guess it will help to ease the tensions with other countries. Now, obviously, we can also go to the revisit the trade agreement with the U.S. And so some experts suggest that perhaps we could buy more soybeans from the U.S. Therefore, in the short term, you could reduce the imbalances. Although as an economist, there is a question whether this is really the best solution. I was in Australia 2 weeks ago, and I was told the biggest worry for them is another big bargain agreement between China and the U.S. Because if we sign another agreement, we probably will commit to buy a lot more commodities, but that by definition means we're going to buy less from Australia. So there will be some other implications. But I guess if that's something that helps to stabilize the bilateral relation between the two countries, that's something certainly would be on the table. The fourth point, which I never thought about, but that's probably something we should think about, whether appreciation of the Chinese currency would be helpful to not to improve the relation, but at least to show that we're willing to do something to maintain a stable trade relation with the U.S. And this is a little bit like a Plaza Accord too. But I know most people have a very different assessment about the impact, exact impact of the Plaza Accord, the one. The fifth option, which is discussed by some experts and even officials, is that can we use the voluntary export restraint, the VER, or export tax in order to reduce the external surpluses. The sixth is obviously decoupling in select sectors. Wherever you feel most sensitive, most uncomfortable, we accept some restrictions, but in other areas, it continue business as usual. Retaliation, whether or not, if the U.S. decided to increase the tariffs, should we also increase the tariffs or should we not increase the tariffs? This is an issue being debated in China, and some argue that maintaining an open trade regime is probably in the best interest of China. But I think in terms of political economy, it will be very difficult. And some even argued that if we can help on some other issues that U.S. is concerned, for instance, Ukraine, I don't know how that is going to happen, but some suggest that it might be useful. So I'm just giving a list of some of the ways we could look at. They might be helpful, they might not be helpful, they might be feasible, they might not be feasible. I like just to show you the list, and I'd love to hear your feedbacks later on the trade relations. The biggest question at the moment, obviously, one of the biggest questions is the overcapacity issue. And we heard a lot of negative comments, both in the US and in Europe. The broader context and the background, I think, for China is that growth model is changing. And if we used to rely on low-cost advantage to produce manufacturing goods, this has to change. This has to change because economic conditions are changing. I'm sorry to put up a book we jointly did with Brookings, and I hope at some stage we'll be able to produce something together with Peterson. But in that book, what we found was economic conditions are changing very rapidly during the past decade. Cost levels are rising quickly. Aging is becoming a factor today, and the globalization is reversed in some areas. That, I think, to me, there are lots of implications, takeaways from this change. But one very important message is that we need to move to innovation-driven growth, i.e. the growth model has to change, and we have to depend on more on growth. And so I think China has been trying very hard to facilitate innovation. In some areas, it's not very successful. In some areas, in some other areas, it's becoming so successful, and it caused lots of concerns in the rest of the world. So we had the honor of hosting Secretary Yellen at our school a few months ago, and the first thing she said was, your overcapacity in the EVs and number of green energy sectors is going to hurt the industries in the rest of the world. And she pointed to two terms. Number one is state subsidy, and number two is state direction. So I'm sure you're very familiar with these numbers. China has become a very big player in the automobile space, and including the EVs. I still remember China joined the WTO in 2001. At that time, the most experts, officials were worried about the three sectors: agriculture, banking sector, and automobile industry. And the worry was if the tariff is coming down from 100% to 25%, there would be no room for future development of the domestic automobile industry, because when the market is open, the foreign brand names will just take over the domestic market. That's somehow ironic to them. Although as an economist, I thought liberalization is the way to facilitate innovation and the development of the new industry. But what obviously is controversial, as I said, the Secretary Yellen said state subsidy and the state direction was the problem. I actually told her last year we only exported 10,000 units to the US. And I thought that the actual impact will be limited. But you all know the months after she came back from China, the US government quickly raise the tariffs on EV from China to 100%. So obviously that's whether or not you already having a big impact is another issue, but people are so worried that if the Chinese EVs come in, they will have a big negative impact. So I looked at the state subsidy, the narrowly defined state subsidy. These numbers not by myself, by a couple of scholars from Cornell University. And you can find in terms of national subsidy on EV per unit of EV, the number in China is not high. In fact, it's somewhere in the middle. Before it is Norway, US, France, Germany, UK, and so on. So, but obviously this is only a part of the problem. And then the second issue is more about implicit subsidy. Jay Shambo, in one of his speeches, cited a study by another think tank in DC, CSIS, the red ink, I'm sure you're all familiar with. Their finding was implicit subsidy through distorted factor costs were about 5% of GDP. And they call it industrial subsidy. And that, if you add that to the explicit subsidy, then the number is much bigger. My reaction, in fact, when the CSIS team was doing this job, they talked to me over online, and I said to them, I do not dispute the 5% number, because like 14, 15 years ago, this was one of my key research interests. I published quite a number of papers, but the interpretation is very different. The reason why the factor cost was distorted in China was to facilitate what we call dual-track liberalization. When the private sector was liberalized and giving more space to grow, we still want to maintain the state sector, but the state sector cannot compete with the private sector. You need some kind of support, either explicit fiscal subsidy or implicit subsidy through low-cost factor. Credit, land, and so on. So if you find a number, and you can find my number 15 years ago, is also about 5% of GDP. But in my view, this 5% of GDP was given to the SOEs as a part of the transition policy. It's not an industrial policy. And you can tell me, the companies nowadays, people worry about to compete in international market with the US and the European companies, especially in these new green energy sectors. Are they mainly SOEs or are they mainly private companies? I can tell you majority of them are all private companies. And I can tell you at the domestic market, the private companies actually were disadvantaged because of this factor cost distortion, because the majority of the distortion went to the state-owned companies. So as a private company, you not only do not benefit from it, you're actually disadvantaged by this policy distortion. So again, as I said, I do not dispute the numbers they put together, but it simply say just the government is giving lots of subsidy, this amount of money to the new tech companies and so on. I think that was completely wrong. But obviously, having said that, I can't really deny that there are some subsidies in it, and I would say it's mainly from the local government. Local governments all have this so-called investment promotion programs. In Chinese, we call it 招商引资. All local governments trying very hard to boost local companies in the green energy sector. That's why we have about 80 EV companies across the country. All local governments want to be a part of it. So on that point, and I think there is significant room for improvement, especially at the local level, because that's not sustainable. You could say there are some implicit subsidies there. The good news is, number one, the third plenum of the 20th Party Congress explicitly said they want to rationalize the local government investment promotion program. They explicitly prohibit irregular and illegal subsidies by the local government. The second point, which is not a very happy result, but it could lead to similar result, is that local governments are all running out of money. They don't even have enough money to pay the salaries of the local employees. So that portion of the subsidy is also coming down. So I think that my overall story about the excess capacity issue is that what happened is explicit subsidy is limited, but the state direction does play a bigger role. When the central government said, these are the industries we want to develop, and you find a different level of government all moving in the same direction. My complaint is that you have new 3 things. It's a good story, but we should actually have new 300, new 3,000 things, not just the 3 narrow things. And this is where I think the state direction should be reduced, let the market to have a bigger impact. And so my final point is now you already have this capacity, and people calculate, well, to some extent, this supply in China is bigger than global demand. The question is, what do we do about it? The first point, I think, as I said, most of these companies are privately owned. And as the government gradually withdraw, especially local government withdraw their implicit subsidy, I think we start to see a major wave of consolidation. These private companies, if they start to lose money, they will have to react. They're unlike the SOEs, they just can continue. So this is a very different story. The second point is then I actually think since the capacity is already there, maybe we should think of a way of making use of it. And that reminds me of your Marshall Plan after the Second World War. You put together some finance to support revitalization of the European economy. In the end, I think it benefited a lot of parties, including in the US. So my proposal, that was a proposal I made in late May, was that maybe China should devise something like a Chinese Green Marshall Plan, what I call Global South Green Development. China could do it on its own, or China could do it together with other parties. In fact, Brian Deese, Biden's former director of the National Economic Council, wrote an article a couple of months ago saying that maybe the US should devise something called the Clean Energy Marshall Plan. And certainly I think if we can all do that in that direction, because green development is something that the entire world would require, including the developing countries. But the developing countries do not have enough funding, technology, products, and we have it already somewhere here, and the technology is actually very useful, including the solar panels. And some industrial professionals told me, without the cost of the solar panels being so cheap today, it would be impossible for these the solar energy companies to be profitable. So my final point and a suggestion, and I think maybe we should think about, I'm not saying the overcapacity, the whole thing is reasonable or most efficient way of producing the capacity, but looking at what we have today, we probably should think together about the best ways of making use of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yiping. Such an interesting discussion, and thanks to the organizers. I'm delighted to be here. Yiping talked about a way out of what we see as perhaps a coming train crash, and I really commend his creative thinking. It was interesting to see his views on the overcapacity issue, and it's very clear that more clarity on the sources and the definitions, where exactly we're seeing overcapacity and why, is really needed before we start thinking about how we respond to it. Yiping also engaged in some creative thinking about how to use the existing Chinese capacity. Unfortunately, both in the US and in Europe, we only hear negative things about it while the climate crisis continues to deepen throughout the globe. And I think here the US risks, its warnings falling on deaf ears, because there are many specifically in the Pacific Islands come to mind, who see this as an existential threat that's coming to them very quickly, more quickly than we perhaps really keep in mind. And last, I think it's true, and it's classic Yiping, is to remind us always of the importance of market forces in steering economies. This is very important since the US is engaging on what would be a very dramatic change in the government's approach to managing the economy, something which actually has been going on for 8 years. Of course, we can think of the first trade war. We can look at the revitalization, I would say, of Buy America provisions. We can think about the landmark U.S. Legislation known as the U.S. industrial policy. And now, of course, we're on the cusp of very dramatic changes in U.S. commercial policy toward the rest of the world. So in thinking about this, I wanted to perhaps strike an optimistic note, creative note also, I hope, thinking about market forces. And one of the things is you can repeal certain laws, but maybe you can't repeal the laws of economics. And what I want to think about, and it's just at the early stages, but I encourage you to think about it as well, is what are the economic constraints on extreme policies? And here I'm focusing only on the United States. We have such distinguished Chinese economists with us today that I'm going to stay out of their lane. So looking first, let's look at the Trump plan as we know it. Of course, we have a new policy brief released this morning about the tariffs and what sectors they would hit. And we have a section there called known unknowns. And one of the unknowns is we really don't know much about how President-elect Trump will roll out these tariffs, which countries they'll hit, whether there will be exemptions or carve-outs, et cetera. But we do know what he's promised on the campaign trail, and that's what I'm going to use to kind of show what the extreme version of the program would look like. So 60 to 100% tariffs on all U.S. imports from China. Depends on which campaign stop you were at, whether you got the 60 or the 100. 10 to 20% tariffs on other trading partners. More recently, he has threatened a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico if they don't meet demands for assistance with border control and drug interdiction. Quite a bit of discussion about revoking permanent normal trade relations for China, something that has been espoused by both the Secretary of State designate Mario Rubio and U.S. Trade Representative designate Jamieson Greer. And then last, possibly using FTA or free trade agreement renegotiations to tighten rules of origin to displace Chinese value added in exports to the United States from third countries. So my question is, will hard economic realities constrain these plans? They can't all be rolled out on day one, despite what the president-elect sometimes seems to indicate. So as he moves forward, what kind of feedback will he get, not only through his constituents or from lobbying, but also just from the economic impact of these policies? I think the first constraint is that the promised tariff hikes will lead to higher producer input prices and final goods prices, and that, as we've just seen in the last election, the American public seems primed to oppose politicians that raise the inflation rate. Here are, sorry for the size, we have the policy brief released this morning. You can see it in all its beautiful glory on the internet. But this is the set of sectors that we have, and the gray part of the bar shows you the increase in the tariff rate that would hit each of these sectors. This is just trade with China. And what we know is that there are existing tariffs on, right now, about 60% of the goods we import from China. Those tariffs now are about 14 to 15%. The average has come down because U.S. Importers have substituted away from China for goods that were very heavily taxed. But you can see that the majority of sectors are going to see tariffs that are above 40%, some of them reaching 50%. Two sectors I'd like to highlight based on the column on the right, where the darker green colors indicate larger bundles of imports. You can see that the largest bundle of imports coming from China to the United States is electronics and electrical machinery. These were very lightly taxed in the U.S.-China trade war. We expect there to be more than a 50% additional tariff, so in percentage points, 50 percentage point increase on the tariff rate if President Trump carries through on his flat 60 on China. In fact, many of the goods in that category had zero tariff, including some very important items for American households and American businesses, including laptops, cell phones, smartwatches, etc. Oh, gaming consoles, something that has been definitely noted online. What would happen if Trump were to hit countries that are outside of China? These are countries that are not Chinese and are not our FTA partners. And what we see for now, the U.S. has very low tariff rates, oftentimes below 1%. So many of them would see increases above 8%, almost up to 10%. And of these, of course, we see the top 5 there: machinery, electronics, transportation equipment, and chemicals. Our non-FTA partners include very large and important trading partners like the European Union and Japan. And we get from them many goods that are similar to the kinds of goods that we also export, human capital and physical capital intensive. And these would, of course, hit many U.S. Companies very hard because these are imported to then be used in U.S. production. The last slide here is for FTA partners. And of course, this is dominated by Canada, Mexico, and South Korea, which is an FTA partner with the United States. And again, looking at the heat map on the right, you can see, of course, what pops is transportation equipment. As we all know, the U.S. automobile industry is fully integrated across North America. Vehicles pass back and forth across the border many times before they are finished. It's unclear how this tariff would be even levied, administered. But nevertheless, that is bundle which is most at risk here. But there's others, including metals, machinery, and electronics. Mexico, of course, receiving investment as some of activity was deflected from China in response to the higher tariffs, and that new trade would be at risk. This is just for Mexico and Canada, again, highlighting the point about transportation equipment, machinery, and electronics. What we showed in an earlier policy brief by Kim Kossing and myself was that these tariffs will fall disproportionately on the middle and working class. We estimated more than $2,600 increase in costs to the median household, with higher burdens on lower income people. So the tariff is a regressive tax, and it would fall very heavily on certain final goods that consumers like. For example, toys. We get almost, I think, 75% of our toys from China. 99% of our footwear is imported, and almost 60% of that comes from China. We were thinking about titling our piece "The Last Good Christmas" because, of course, my memories of Christmas were toys and my mother's famous sock and underwear box, which you would get, was definitely a genuine expression of her love. But of course, many of those things now we know come from China, and those would all see very dramatic increases. Not only that, we point out that moving production away from China is much more difficult than most people think, because China has a capacity developed over years of partnership with the United States in the materials that are used in toys, which are non-toxic for children who put these things in their mouth, as you know. So it's not as easy as some might think to just move even something that people might think is as simple as toys away from China. The second constraint is, of course, China's deep integration already into global value chains. That can only be dislodged with great effort and at a cost. Here we see U.S. total imports from China. That's the yellow line or gold line. And we see it has been decreasing over time as our imports from the rest of the world have increased and really returned to the pre-pandemic trend. However, China has responded not by decreasing its share of global exports, but by shipping those exports to new destinations. And what we see here is the blue line is high-income countries, and China's exports to high-income countries has tapered off, however, has fallen. We see it increasing to low-income, lower middle-income, and upper middle-income countries. Many of these countries are receiving Chinese imports, which are then used in their production for exports to the rest of the world, including, but not only, the United States. This graph is from the Asian Development Bank, and it shows the People's Republic of China forward linkages in global value chains. And this is their sales to the rest of the set of East Asian countries that are then used in the production of goods in those East Asian countries. And we can see that this has increased, in fact, particularly dramatically since the US-China trade war. And of course, the country exhibited on the top, the light blue there, is Vietnam. Of course, a country which to which many manufacturers moved investment in response to the US-China trade war. Now, the question arises as to whether the U.S. will try to drive China out of global value chains. This is something we began discussing many years ago, but it seemed like science fiction. It's definitely something that is being discussed in the United States. There seems to be some appetite for pushing Chinese value added out of supply chains that serve the American market. There are some existing examples already. The solar circumvention case, which looked at solar panel construction in 4 East Asian countries, provisions against foreign entities of concern that was in the Inflation Reduction Act, and then, of course, expectations for the USMCA renewal, US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which we expect will include discussions about enhanced rules of origin, with an eye particularly to make sure that China doesn't invest in Mexico and then export to the United States. What is the likely response of multinationals to these U.S. demands? It may be that there will be more investment in the U.S. using U.S.-based inputs. So we may see U.S. companies, for example, buying their ball bearings or boilers in the United States. But we're very likely, given differences in labor costs, to see U.S. exclusive supply chains. That is, producers producing products only for the U.S. market, and that will have implications for the U.S. price level and for the competitiveness of U.S. exporters who will rely on these inputs and have to pass those costs along. The last constraint, I think, is the effect on U.S. exporters, which I just alluded to. And I think it will lead to intense lobbying. Now, some people in the administration who are likely to be in the new administration have spoken about the importance of the upcoming extension of the Trump-era tax cuts and see this as kind of a quid pro quo that we will make American companies whole, even as we understand that they may face higher costs while we decouple from China. But once that extension is through, one has to worry whether these exporters will really be muted by this, because they will have to meet the challenge of competing in foreign markets against competitors who are not facing the same constraints and higher costs. So, again, there seems to be some quid pro quo, not only with taxes, but with lower energy prices. And the question is, how will this shake out, given that U.S. is the second largest exporter in the world? Exporter turned out to be kind of a dirty word during the campaign. We haven't heard about it, but these companies are enormously important employers in the United States and do the bulk of the job creation within the manufacturing sector. So just to sum up, I think that U.S. protectionism faces important economic constraints. The tariffs will raise prices on inputs and final goods, and that will act as a brake. Other trading partners rely on Chinese inputs. If the administration pushes to reduce Chinese value added from American-made goods, they will push up U.S. import costs further. U.S. exporters will obviously be disadvantaged on net, and the economic realities may come home very soon to the White House. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to joining a very distinguished panel on U.S.-China trade relations. I'm not a trade economist, I'm a macroeconomist. But my last trip to the U.S. was January 2020 for the phase 1 trade deal. Then on the flight back, an official in the Chinese delegation asked me, he said, "You are a economist. Tell us, will this work?" I had a really hard time, thinking a managed trade and tariff actually could help solve the issues between the two countries. Then I said to him, I said, do you want to hear a frank view, or do you want to hear the party line? He said, of course, I want to hear your frank view. I said, this trade phase 1 deal will fix nothing. The bilateral trade imbalances will, given the current policy, will just continue to grow. I guess the only consolation is that actually economics prevail. I mean, that's actually good news for economists. So today I'm going to talk about something I think we need to frame the bilateral relationship from an economics point of view. We need to agree on some basics before we try to find the solutions. We tried phase 1, it didn't work. I guess if we continue that route, it won't work again, the next time around. By the way, all the findings I'm presenting today is mostly done by my colleagues at CF40 Institute. I'm just presenting their results. Fact 1, I think, this is already mentioned by Professor Huang, Yiping, and many. The bilateral imbalances is really macro imbalances. And if you look at either current account surplus of China and the current account deficit of the US, or the manufacturing surplus of China or manufacturing deficit of US, they are just like mirror images. China is the ultimate supplier of goods, and the US is the ultimate consumer of goods. We could argue which one drives which one, but if you don't address the underlying macro factors behind those charts, bilateral trade tensions will always be there. At least for this time around, after the COVID, I think the reason that the bilateral imbalances start to grow and the global imbalances start to grow is, for me, it's pretty clear. It's when, on the one hand, China is having a massive real estate adjustment. Real estate price volume is down by somewhere around 50% to 60%. That's enormous adjustment of the housing sector. At the same time, the US is running the biggest peacetime fiscal expansion ever. That is my reading of why the bilateral imbalances is growing again. Fact 2, I think this is really Mary already said a lot. I think if you look at quite long-term picture, the bilateral trade between US and China actually really helped to keep price down in the US. One fact actually surprised me a lot. China's export price actually didn't grow in the past 20 years. Just zero. It's 100 at 2004. It's 100 in 2024. Everything else, there are inflation, but China's export to US actually there's no inflation. That helps to keep US price low. But I think this is not the only mechanism. If you look at a global picture, China now accounts for about more than 30% of global manufacturing output. It's probably close to or even equal to the G7 manufacturing output put together. What is the implication for that? Actually, if we did some analysis looking at the price movements between China's PPI and the G7 PPI. One thing we found out is we think it's very convincing. I mean, China's PPI is driving PPIs in G7. G7's PPI moves have relatively less impact by their domestic macro conditions. It have little to do there to oil price. The most important factor driving G7 PPI actually is Chinese PPI. It's pretty clear that so Chinese manufacturing price is anchoring global manufacturing price. Even if the two countries won't trade, the price level in many countries probably is still determined by China. Suppose the U.S. is going to impose massive tariff on Chinese export or try to kick out China's product out of the supply chain in the U.S., I would guarantee you that there will be much more inflationary impact on U.S. goods price than the narrow imports from China would suggest. A third fact is, there are a lot of people believe that China is doing massive manufacturing investment, which leads to overcapacity, and there's not enough domestic absorption, which leads to massive export, then create a lot of issues. We look at data more carefully. The picture is more mixed than the narrative would suggest. Yes, in a small set of sectors, particularly EV, solar panel, batteries, there's a lot of capacity expansion and capital investment in the past several years. But if you took out those very narrow set of industries, other Chinese manufacturing sectors actually don't have capacity expansion in the past several years. They just don't. And if you look at what is driving their investment decision, it's very, very similar to what's in Europe or in the US. It's their revenue growth. Companies have higher revenue growth, they invest more. Companies have less revenue growth, they invest less. So the overinvestment leads to overcapacity narrative probably only apply to 10% of China's manufacturing sector. 19% of China's manufacturing sector actually is responding to price signals, responding to market forces. Fact 4, we also look at the government subsidy. I think Professor Huang made very good comments on that. We did something different. We basically took listed companies, they reported how much subsidy, explicit subsidy they can receive from governments, both central and local governments, mostly from local governments. And we run some regressions to explore the variations of subsidy they receive and the investment decisions they make. What do we find out? More than 80% of their investment decision actually is driven by revenue. That's already said. And yes, government subsidy also affect their investment decision, but probably only account for 5% of their investment decision pre-pandemic. And I can only explain 1% of their investment decision post-pandemic. So subsidy have the exact sign of cost more investment, but it's really, really minor compared to other factors. So we did some counterfactual analysis. Suppose all the explicit subsidy were removed to those companies. If you see the charts, there's very, very little impact on their final investment volume. So subsidy is a factor, but it's much smaller factor than people would think. Fact 5. The last trade war, we don't call it trade war in China, we call it US-China trade frictions, but no matter how we call it, last trade war, there's no obvious impact on the US economy of the first trade war. I mean, China didn't feel much of the pain either last time around, so which leads to people think, okay, trade wars sounds bad, but the actual impact is small. One important factor last time is, the U.S. imposed on average 10.8% additional tariff on China's export, but the import price from China increased only by 3.5%. So the additional tariff on China's export didn't really show up in the final goods price in the U.S. Why is that? Last time around, there's one very important macro factor. The currency, renminbi, depreciated from somewhere around 6.3 to around 7. So depreciated by about 8%. And the Chinese government provided some around 2% tax rebate to exporters. So that add up to 10% of export to US. So the additional US tariff on China is almost entirely offset by currency depreciation and to a smaller extent and tax rebate. I guess that's why neither country feel the pain. Chinese export don't feel the pain, and the U.S. imports didn't feel the pain. I guess this time around, it could be a little bit different. A question is whether China would allow the currency to move from the current level if there's tariff, whether China would allow the currency to move from current level to even more depreciated level. I don't know. I simply don't think that is it is still a possibility, but I don't think it's the central scenario I could see. My sense is that China probably won't allow the currency to move a lot. So the buffer last time around, the currency adjustment, probably won't be around this time. If there's no such buffer this time, actually, when tariff is imposed, I think there will be a lot of pain being felt than last time around. That's fact 5. I guess the most sensitive issue right now is really about overcapacity in the new energy sector or in the green energy sector. I try to think this. On the one hand, we are stressing there is a climate emergency. We need to greening everything. Then at the same time, China is bringing down all the costs of that is very necessary to greening the economy, like solar panel, like wind, and the green. The latest data suggests actually it's cheaper now to generate electricity through solar and wind than coal, which is a very, very good thing. I don't think there's any dispute that the whole cost is driven down because of China's massive capacity and technology advancement in those sectors. Of course, we need to be mindful. I think Professor Huang said this really well. I think that there's still going to be shock spillovers because of the massive advancement of China in those sectors, and that there will be spillovers to a lot of legacy manufacturing jobs in Europe, in US. One example is that China was exporting less than 1 million cars 5 years ago. Now this year, China probably will be exporting around 6 million cars. That is a hugely politically sensitive sector. So I think China should be mindful of the spillovers we may have, even though I think it's a good thing globally and for the climate, we still need to be mindful of the spillover we may have on the countries. I think what Professor Huang proposed is a good solution, a green Marshall Plan. I think we probably also can consider some voluntary export restriction, just to mitigate the shocks that we might have on other countries, just to smooth the political transition in other countries. I'll stop here and thank you.
great to be here among former colleagues. I think some of us in this room know that I actually was introduced to the Peterson Institute when I was working on CF40. So I used to be the Chinese side of this collaboration, and now I'm on the US side. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different than what's been covered so far, which alludes to what Carolyn mentioned at the beginning of the shift from and the blurring of lines between economic security and national security. When I started here, I was fully focused on financial reform in China, but in response to structural shifts in the demand for think tank research in Washington, away from pieces on China's economy and generally, much more to the national security issues, I've started to move and blend a little bit of that myself. So I'll be looking at where do we stand with US restrictions on China, on economic ties with China, and what is the outlook like for Trump's second term. So beginning, we know that the economic measures restricting commerce with China have proliferated since the Trump administration, and this includes many different areas. The first is national security reviews that have restricted investment from China into the US, and most recently also US investment into China, inbound and outbound. The next is restrictions that have targeted specific Chinese entities, most famously beginning with Huawei, and ZTE under the Trump administration, and this includes export control entity lists, sanctions, and lists that restrict investment in specific Chinese companies. Then the Biden administration went beyond these entity-focused restrictions and started restricting exports of advanced semiconductors and equipment to make them across the entirety of China and now to any Chinese entity, no matter where they are in the world, an extraordinary expansion. Then also bans on import and sale of Chinese connected vehicles, which recently was put into place by the Biden administration. And then also an increase in the number of these controls which apply extraterritorially, where the US uses a hook of either the US dollar or US technology in the goods to stop other countries from exporting to China or investing in China. Begin with investment security reviews, where concerns about Chinese investment in the US, especially in Silicon Valley, led the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, CFIUS, to expand its jurisdiction due to changes that Congress put in through legislation. And this chart shows, I'll just focus you on the blue, which is the number of new transactions that CFIUS has reviewed. And you can see that early in the Trump administration, before he came into office, it was about 136 a year, and then that has now doubled, and it continued to rise under Biden, has come down a little bit, not due to reduction in national security concerns, but because higher interest rates have led to less deal making. One of the interesting things here is that CFIUS has effectively become a brick wall for many Chinese investments, so a lot of the increased scrutiny has actually come onto non-Chinese companies. 9 out of 10 CFIUS reviews today are done on non-Chinese companies, and often those are US allies. And of course, then it becomes, what are the ties of those allies to China? And that can lead to those being scrutinized increasingly. One question we have is Trump going to be more open to Chinese investment than the Biden administration? Some of the comments he's made actually suggest that may be the case, but a lot of the people he's looking to bring into his administration would not be open to that. Then looking at sanctions and export controls, this chart shows the export control entity list. This restricts US exports, and in some cases extraterritorially exports to the listed entities. The orange is all additional entities added to the list under each different presidential term, actually under each president, and the blue is the Chinese. And one of the most interesting things, I just love this chart because it shows that Obama started to use the entity list much more than Bush and Clinton. So that's really where the rise in the entity list occurs. But then it's under Trump, really, that this first begins to target China in a major way. And more than half of the entities around the world, these are companies, individuals, research institutes, maybe even parts of government, more than half of those targeted under Trump are Chinese. And then Biden continues, instead of taking in a different direction, he builds on it. And then in addition has added many, many Russian, Belarusian entities, and many Chinese entities are on this list because of helping Russia, for example. So you see the kind of different focus, but consistent is increased use of this tool. And extraterritoriality has been something relatively new here, and this responds to the challenge of globalization, where actually if you control just exports from the United States, you're not going to hit very much because the US doesn't export that much. And so what the US has instead done is used its unique position in the semiconductor supply chain to control what, say, TSMC in Taiwan can send for chips that it makes to China. And recently, this has been expanded in an absolutely extraordinary way. Just last week, the US has now said that anything that has a chip in it, anywhere in the world, no matter where it's made, no matter if it has any US components whatsoever, could be export controlled by the United States, because any chip is likely a direct product of US technology, and therefore anything containing the chip we could control. So that is quite a serious escalation. But one of the interesting things about this so far, and I think is not generally understood, is that US has used export controls in a major way, but sanctions, although many Chinese entities have been sanctioned, Mary and I and another colleague have done a study looking at the SDN list, which would extraterritorially apply these controls based on the US dollar, and no major Chinese entity is on the US sanctions list. Not a single major financial institution, not a single major technology company. And so that's really something the US has reserved for a really bad rainy day kind of scenario. The US has not so far weaponized the dollar against China. It has definitely threatened to do so, but it has not done so yet. The firms that have been targeted under these kind of really harsh sanctions so far are just kind of small import-export companies that are doing diversion of goods to Iran and North Korea, that kind of thing. What about looking forward? So we've seen that there's a lot of continuation from the first Trump administration to the next Biden administration. What might we see in the Trump term? The first term was divided, as we could see from the Phase 1 trade deal that Guokai mentioned, was a real struggle between camps that believed in engagement with China. Much of the first Phase 1 trade agreement would have increased the ties between the US and China economically, but then there were also hawks who wanted to pursue decoupling. If you combine those two together, you get not particularly coherent policy. But the US consensus now is far more hawkish than before. So I think the engagement crew will be much weaker. I think it will exist, but will be much weaker. And instead, what you'll see is also a China hawkish, but maybe a more pro-tech group, and that will have more nuanced views on China. I suspect that deal making that will be done will focus mostly on tariff side, because congressional opposition would be extremely strong to any sort of suggestion that Trump could roll back any of these restrictive measures with China in exchange for some sort of promises from China. Many of the appointments that have been made so far in key positions are extremely hawkish on China, at least publicly, in many of the most important positions. And I think we'll see less of a focus, which we saw under the Biden administration, which was small yard, high fence. I think people in China would generally disagree and say the yard is not small anymore. I think a lot of people could legitimately say that these semiconductor controls have a pretty big yard, but at least that was the philosophical idea behind what they were doing. The Trump administration, I think, is not likely to believe in a small yard. They're going to believe in tough deterrence, and so we'll probably see more blunt use of these controls, despite some mixed messages from Trump where he said he'd be open to EV investment from China in the United States. What will we see in these areas? I think FDI screening, we'll see many more sectors targeted where US cannot invest in China. I think we'll see a lot more use of extraterritorial controls where the US tries to stop what other countries can send to China. And one, I would kind of pose the question of whether they would put a company like Huawei on the SDN sanctions list, which despite putting them on the entity list 149 times to cover all of their individual subsidiaries, they have not yet used the dollar sanctions and forced the rest of the world to decouple from Huawei. Just very briefly, potential effects of this agenda on the China and the United States. Many of these controls will raise costs on China in the short term, but probably accelerate China's own ability to develop its own domestic industry as it's forced to do so because it can't rely on US inputs. And as these tools are used in disruptive ways, there will be an attempt to design out US technology from global supply chains that could end up benefiting China. And then I am looking now at serious risks from Chinese retaliation, because one of the most interesting things is there's been no retaliation until very recently for all of these measures, whereas there was direct retaliation on the tariff side. but that is ending, and I think we'll see a much more scary round of escalation as the Trump administration puts new ones on. Thank you.
So thank you all very much. Those were terrific presentations, and I'm also very impressed by the timekeeping. So I will try to make sure that we finish on time. We've got another interesting session later. It seemed to me there were a few sort of big overlaps and questions, and I would like to get, and you should all feel free to react to each other's comments as well. So I'm just going to lay out 3 of them and get reactions, if I may. One was the idea that China's investment in green technology could be good for the world. You know, actually, somebody, former colleague of mine, did joke that maybe the US should be writing a thank you letter to China and to President Xi as opposed to being so annoyed. But as Kai mentioned, this is autos are a very, very political sector, especially in Europe. So is there some way to think of directing, whether it's through a Green Marshall Plan, directing these investments around the world? Is that something that one can imagine the US and China working together on, or not? And maybe where's the role of Europe, but that may be going too far. The second is, in a way, Mary laid out the economic constraints, and they were touched on also in other comments, particularly the concern about inflation and impact on exports of tariffs, and how that would, it might well show up in US markets, which would also be a constraining factor probably on future President Trump, but it might stop things going into effect. I wonder, are there those sorts of economic constraints that will affect what Martin was talking about more, the export controls and this blurring that I talked about between national security and economic security? And I'd be interested in views on that. And the final thing is, yes, as economists, we agree that the global imbalance, that the imbalances are reflecting macroeconomic considerations. There's also, as Larry Summers was saying yesterday in a conversation that he had with Bob Zoellick under an Adam about international economics, looking at a bilateral relationship doesn't make much sense compared to a multilateral, although a lot of the charts do look as if the big issues are between China as a surplus and the US as a deficit country. Is there a way to multilateralize this issue in the way that happened back after the global financial crisis, or does that make it more dangerous for relations between the two countries because it would drive people into different camps? So those are 3 things that I raise, and maybe I can turn, if you don't mind, Mary, I want to turn to you to see on the green issue, and then also on the economic constraints and the export controls. Can you see economic constraints on those? And then I'll go around to the rest of you.
Try to be brief. On the green tech and the rest of the world, I mean, we can put countries into 3 buckets. One is countries that have big, important auto sectors, and I think for them, you know, this is a very politically sensitive and difficult problem. countries that are participating in global value chains, perhaps they're making roof racks or tires, and then countries which really don't have any auto production. And for that third group, clearly, cheaper EVs are a blessing. The middle country, I think China could win, you know, the hearts and minds by opening up their own production to their participation in these global value chains. And on the advanced economies, I mean, it's clear that these countries cannot let their auto industries wither away. And so I was very heartened to hear Guo Kai's talk about VERs. What would a negotiated outcome look like? Right now, there's such little trust that we're not really able to think creatively about a world in which, you know, one side has to have, Europe has to have, US has to have, China has to have. On the economic constraints hitting national security, and one of the points we make in our policy brief, that is Martin and I and Christine Wang, is that economics is important. It needs to be brought into discussion more formally. And the State Department recently hired a chief economist for its division that deals with this. Commerce needs similar capabilities. Obviously, economics is important. We had, at the beginning of the Trump administration, a new defense strategy that said economic security is national security. So, you know, burning up the economy for what? Obviously, if, you know, we're facing an existential crisis, you burn up a lot of seed capital. But if you're not, so again, economics needs to be brought in some kind of formal cost-benefit analysis to at least conceptualize it in one way. The other is the dialogue about camps. I think the U.S. needs to be more circumspect, really needs to think and envision where are we headed if we go down different paths, scenario planning, if you will. If China pursues openness and allows other countries to participate in its own new energy success, I think you'll find that the camps are asymmetrically sized, and that the U.S., my fear is that America first equals America alone on economy. And I think I tried to signal that in my remarks, talking about the creation of value chains that serve only the American market, what that would do to the competitiveness of American-based production. We're riding high now. We're having a lot of investment into the United States. Economy's great. We all expect it's going to be great in the next year. I don't want to sound like, you know, the sky is falling, but we need to look forward and think, how do we maintain our competitiveness? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yiping, may I ask you to comment on those issues or any others, picking up on anything?
Okay. Well, I probably will raise a question about the economic constraint, especially in relation to inflation. I mean, as economists will say, well, if you impose 60 or 100% tariffs, the inflation rate will rise and the government will have to respond. But during the past couple of days, and we're hearing lots of different things, one view is that trade is still relatively a small part of the U.S. economy. So even if it does have some impact on inflation, it might not be a big number in terms of the overall CPI. Is that something that's possible? Trump himself said, well, he imposed the tariffs for some time and he didn't see inflation until Biden took over and the Ukraine conflict and so on. So that's the first part of the question, whether that will be material enough and for everybody to realize it's a big problem. The second question is also, even if assume it's a problem, will the Trump administration, especially the president himself, recognize that mechanism or that channel? And what would be his response? I mean, rational people sometimes, if you do something and the inflation go up, and if you don't like inflation and you modify, adjust your policy, right? But I also heard some commentators say, well, another option is he will look at the inflation and he say, well, the Fed is not doing a good job. What do you think is more likely?
Personally, I think, and this is something that none of you mentioned, but may come up in the next session, I do think the administration will be keeping an eye on markets, financial markets, and that what happens in the stock market will be important. And of course, what's happened since the election tends to happen after every US election because of the end of certainty, but it's certainly, there's been a massive Trump bounce, which suggests that there is either no concern about the possible bad economic impacts, or no short-term concern, or an expectation that they won't actually be carried out. So I'd like to turn now to Kai, Professor Guo.
Okay. You know, on the green technology, you know, we look at historical examples of a country running big surpluses, like China is having now. That we find 3 examples. One is British Empire before World War I, and how they recycled their surplus was doing infrastructure investment in its colonies. I think the equivalence of that for China is the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. I think if you really want China to have less overcapacity selling into US or Europe, I think US probably want to think about actually to support BRI, not to actually to work against BRI. That's one way to actually absorb China's overcapacity. A second example is the US after World War II. US was running a lot of surplus. I think what US did was Marshall Plan, essentially gave away those surplus to Europe. I think this is consistent with Professor Huang's idea about a green Marshall Plan. Essentially, you do some kind of aid grant to those developing countries to help them green their economy, at the same time actually help to absorb those overcapacity. A third example was Japan in the 1980s. What happened was Japan doing a lot of FDI in the US. I think when, I don't know whether this is feasible or not, plausible or not, I think Martin hinted that it could be possible, is US actually open up to Chinese FDI into the green space. Solar panels, EVs, you know, those firms will be doing things according to US standard, and it will create US jobs, and it will reduce tensions, but I don't know whether this is politically feasible or not. That's on the green technology part. On whether we can multilateralize it, you know, I spent a good chunk of my career when I was at central bank doing G20 stuff, you know. What I found, I mean, that is still very, very good multilateral forum, but I think when that forum is most effective when actually China and US agree on something. So even if we want to multilateralize it, I guess the US, China need to sort themselves out before making it multilateral. So I guess that's my answer. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Martin, do you have any comments on what others have said or on the questions that I raised?
Sure. First, on the cost side, I think one of the challenges has been that because there's been such an incredible boom in chip making and in AI chips, the costs of the US export controls haven't really shown up yet overall, because the companies have so much demand, more than they can possibly supply, that not being able to sell to China mostly just means they sell to somebody else. But this is not true in most industries. So as these controls expand, I think the costs will be much more clear. And if we get into some sort of downturn, and the chip sector is not a sector that booms without end, it has a lot of cycles. And when we get in the down cycle, those controls will be much more painful. No one on the US side has talked about overcapacity yet, so I want to just quickly respond to some of the things in Yiping and Guokai's presentation. I see the subsidy side a little bit differently, and I think counterintuitively I would say that elimination of Chinese subsidies caused the overcapacity problem. And what I mean by that is there used to be a lot of subsidies on the producer side and on the consumer side. And so you were subsidized to produce, but you were also subsidized when you bought. And then when China cut last year the consumer subsidies, suddenly EVs became much more expensive to the consumer. And the Chinese EV companies responded by, and Tesla, by the way, in the Chinese market, responded by cutting their prices significantly. They were still subsidized to produce a lot, but their people buying them were no longer. And so then they had to find new destinations for it, and the price went down. So it's kind of an interesting, like, general equilibrium look at it. And I think that one of the most interesting things to read on this is the European Commission report on subsidies in the Chinese EV sector, because I think what you'll find, contrary to the finding about subsidies being limited in what they disclose, is that there are a huge number of hidden subsidies in this sector that are not showing up as direct subsidies. One example is if you export a battery to Europe, you don't get to get the VAT rebate. But if you send an EV to China, you get the VAT rebate. What that means is the same Chinese battery to a Chinese producer is much cheaper than to a foreign producer. So China has found ways to use its dominance in battery and other upstream parts of the EV supply chain to create an advantage for its own companies to export, not as much to produce outside. So there are a lot of ways there, and I really would underscore one thing that Mary said about multilateralizing the issue is that this is going to be a challenge, because for most countries that don't have these industries, they're happy to import and get that saving and climate benefit. But to countries that have that sector themselves, they'll put up barriers, and they are doing so across the world, not just the US and EU, but many others. But it's a patchwork. So China will still probably find enough demand for overcapacity goods and regular capacity goods.
Yeah. Well, a lot of managing going on there. I want to see if there are any questions from the audience, and otherwise we will wrap up and have a very quick coffee break and then move on to the rest of the next session. But would somebody like to? Yes, Mark Sobel.
Thank you. Since nobody's asking any questions, I had a question for our Chinese colleagues. So in past years, in terms of exchange rate issues, China said it focused on the trade-weighted issue. But today's discussion was about, to the extent we talked about exchange rates, was dollar, RMB. So I mean, it seems as the RMB, like all other currencies, somewhat down in anticipation of Trump coming in. The real RMB fell very significantly in the past few years. So I guess my question is, how do you think the authorities are viewing the dollar RMB versus trade-weighted RMB as Trump comes in? Is it just to focus on the dollar and the trade-weighted is much less important these days?
Thanks very much. Guo Kai is apparently designated to respond.
I think you're right. I think there seems to be some shift from a focus on a trade-weighted currency to more focusing on the bilateral US dollar and renminbi exchange rate, which I think probably is not the most appropriate framework to think about policies going forward, because of the potential tariffs, and you need some room to adjustment. If you focus too much on bilateral exchange rate, you limit your room of maneuver. But on the other hand, I also disagree with including IMF's recommendation saying, okay, suppose there is tariff on China, you should let your currency respond to that tariff. So you depreciate your currency and you offset the impact. I think that would be counterproductive in a multilateral sense, because the burden of the tariff will be shifted towards other trading partners like Europe, like Japan, like Korea, which create another trouble. So my thinking right now is that we actually wrote a piece several days ago. I think China probably should focus on a trade-weighted basket without US. So China tried to maintain some stability against its non-US trading partners in terms of the exchange rate, while allow enough flexibility between dollar and the RMB. So you can have some room to responding to US dollars while you do not let your currency depreciate against other trading partners, so you don't actually shift the burden towards them. I guess that's probably is a compromise that is better suited going forward. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much to all of the panel. Terrific presentations, and thank you again.
Thank you.
economic outlook for 2025. You know, this is a really interesting time. The end of the year, you know, we were just in the US for a few days, but we can feel the exuberance in the US market, and everybody seems to be pretty comfortable about where the US economy is. And the Fed will meet next week. It's really, and there's a lot of policy uncertainties about what the incoming administration will be doing or not doing. At the same time, just a few hours ago, China's Central Committee finished this Central Economic Conference, outlining the thinking on the next year's economic growth and policies. So it's really a very, very good time to talk about economic outlook of both countries. We have 4 very distinguished speakers today. I'll go through their briefly. Go through their names briefly. The first will be Mr. Gao Shanwen. He's our CF40 Academic Committee member. He's the chief economist of SDIC Security. He's probably by far the most famous macroeconomist in China. You know, when I introduce him, I always say whenever he speaks, he can move the market either up or down by more than 1%. That's his influence in China. Our second speaker will be Karen Dinan. He's now a non-resident senior fellow at PIIE. He used to work in the US Treasury Department and now is a professor of practice at Harvard University. Our third speaker will be Zhu He. He is a research fellow at CF40 Institute. All my presentation in the previous session is mostly done by him and his colleagues. So he's working a lot on Chinese macroeconomy. Last but not least, the fourth speaker will be David Wilcox. He's now a senior fellow at PIIE. He worked a very long time at the Federal Reserve, also at the US Treasury. So please welcome our speakers for the next session. Mr. Gao, please.
Thank you, Guokai, for your introduction. It's my honor to have this opportunity to share some observations regarding China's economy. People around the world always wonder why China has been so slow and indecisive to stimulate the economy in the past 2 years. Besides data issues, the inherent contradictions deeply rooted in its economic management framework, which was first set up in 1994, have played a fundamental role. A clear understanding of these contradictions may contribute to better understanding of the policy choices and constraints. Generally speaking, I think 3 issues shall be noted as following. First of all, due to various structural changes, China's economic fluctuations have generally shifted from a previously easy to hit up, difficult to cool down model before 2008 to an easy to cool down and difficult to hit up model after the global financial crisis. Therefore, before 2008, the main objective of macroeconomic management was to curb economic overheating, with the main means being monetary tightening. However, on the conditions that the economy was easy to cool down, the main objective must be to boost demand. And against this background, monetary easing is less effective and insufficient. And therefore, fiscal policy has been forced to play a central role in macroeconomic management. However, due to long-standing historical reasons, China's public finance is highly fragmented, and the central government is very small, whose expenditure is even smaller than the budget deficit, accounting for roughly 14% of total government expenditure. Therefore, most of the administrative functions actually are being performed by local governments. Therefore, when counter-cyclical fiscal policies have to be executed, the central government naturally asks the local governments to do the policy. And here laid down the ground for misalignment of responsibilities and interests, paving possibly the way for the thereafter explosive growth of local government debt levels. Second, after 2008, because of sluggish growth in external demand and continuing rapid urbanization in China, real estate sector became an important driver and a key pillar for expanding aggregate demand. However, due to inherent drawbacks in the business model of property developers, and also some of the drawbacks in the regulatory regime regarding property sector, the real estate sector rapidly evolved into some quasi-financial institutions with the potential to create and expand credit. As real estate prices went up sharply, the regulatory bodies began to take measures to reduce risk exposure of the financial institutions, which forced the real estate industry to seek alternative financing channels, therefore further giving rise to a real estate-centered, highly opaque, highly frictional, and largely unregulated shadow financial system, which created significant loopholes and notable gaps in the highly unified and regulated financial system. Third, from the viewpoint of local governments, budget pressures from economic downturn, the requirements from the central government to do counter-cyclical expansion policies, and the desire of local governments to grow local economy have forced them to seek financing channels besides the more normal channel. At the same time, the rapid urbanization has created stronger demand for land, generating huge land sales revenues. Those factors combined together have spawned a shadow fiscal system centered on land transaction and land mortgage, which rapidly integrated with the real estate-centered shadow financial systems. Therefore, in China, in the years after the global financial crisis, we developed a shadow fiscal system and a shadow financial system, which lie largely beyond the monitoring and supervision of local legislature, the supervision of central government, and as I will mention below, also the supervision and monitoring of the financial market. From the viewpoint of the investors, they generally believe that the central government will ultimately bail out local governments. That's the so-called rigid payment belief, which created huge moral hazard problems and make the monitoring of financial market regarding local government debt and that of real estate sector could not work normally. As a result, since global financial crisis, China's debt level climbed up very rapidly along an unsustainable path to already a very dangerous high level, which alarmed the policymakers and the central government, pushing them to take measures to deleverage. Here, the dilemma emerges. When the economy encounters big headwinds, if the policymakers decide to stimulate the economy, the debt level may shoot up again. If they do nothing, the economy may fall into recession and deflation. Therefore, a systematic solution to reform the shadow fiscal system and shadow financial system must be done to systematically deleverage the economy while also smoothly manage the economy. However, given that the economy now is still struggling to absorb the hangover effects of the burst of the housing bubble and to a less extent the local government fiscal crisis, the task to reform the shadow banking system and the shadow fiscal systems is apparently very daunting and must be very time-consuming. Therefore, the central government is very indecisive to choose to stimulate the economy or to regulate and reform the system now. That's all. Thank you.
Hi, and thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here. What I'm going to do in my remarks is I'm going to basically cover three things. And one is where the U.S. economy is now. A second is all the forces and consideration that are going to matter as we think about the outlook going forward, many of which, of course, relate to China, many of which touch on the themes that we've been talking about all morning. And then the third is where I think it shakes out kind of what is likely to happen, to the extent that I can say that. So anyway, let me start with where the economy is now. It's on very solid footing. And so the administration has inheriting what is essentially a strong economy. There are many ways I can put it. I have just two on this slide. And the first is just real GDP in the United States. It had this astonishing bounce back to its pre-COVID trend pretty quickly after the pandemic emerged. And then, of course, it's been strong since then, exceeding pre-pandemic expectations. And then the second is the unemployment rate. Our labor market has cooled, but even with that cooling, you can see that the level that we're at now is consistent with what a lot of people think is the natural rate of unemployment. Meanwhile, I will say, just kind of drilling down to the household and business level, people and businesses have been expecting U.S. economic activity to remain robust. I have here a survey of households, and what I'm showing you is that at all different income levels, you can see expectations for real spending growth over the coming year higher than it was prior to the pandemic. On the right, I've got some data about business expectations for sales and revenue growth. And what you can see there is kind of expectations that are not as high as they were a couple of years ago, but pretty high. And I should say that bounce up in the sales expectation, that's not post-election. That's something that happened in October, maybe based on expectations about the election. Meanwhile, U.S. inflation has come down towards its pre-pandemic range, which was consistent with the Fed's target. What I'm showing you here are three components of core inflation. I like to show them separately because they do have different dynamics, and I think you should model them differently. But what you want to be looking at in this chart is how kind of recent data points compare with what they looked like before the pandemic. And you can see in terms of goods inflation, we are in good shape. Shelter inflation, housing, that is still elevated, although you can see the trend there is downward. We are making progress back towards where we were prior to the pandemic. And core services inflation, sometimes called super core inflation, you can see there it's still elevated relative to pre-pandemic, but again, getting closer to where we were. Okay, so I want to just pause on this for a moment and take a second to interpret these economic developments over the last several years. And I'm doing this because it bears on how we should be thinking about what's going to happen going forward. So first of all, let me talk about the inflation surge. Notwithstanding the stories of peculiarities in the used car market, pictures of ships backed up at ports, stories about mistakes ordering semiconductors, I really think the available evidence is consistent with the inflation surge arising primarily from very strong U.S. demand, increasing to levels beyond what the economy could produce. I have a paper coming out about that very soon. But basically the story here is there's a lot of the aggregate supply curve. If you're an economist, you would say there's a lot of aggregate supply curve that you can move along where supply is pretty elastic and you don't get a lot of inflation, but at some point demand can be pushed so far that you end up on this steeper part of the aggregate supply curve, and prices that demand translates into higher prices. A lot of people say, oh, that story can't be right given that we saw this rapid disinflation. No, I think the rapid disinflation is very consistent with that story, because if you have some ebbing of demand, all you need is to kind of push demand back enough to kind of get off that steep part of the supply curve back to the flat part of the supply curve. So some ebbing of demand from tighter monetary policy, dwindling pandemic savings, that may be enough to kind of take you back to normal inflation dynamics. And on top of that, we had favorable supply developments, some of which were very favorable: elevated rates of immigration, increases in labor force participation that effectively pushed out supply, so that helped too. Okay, so let me talk now about what's going to happen to the US economy. Ordinarily, when I'm asked at this time of year about it, I'm thinking about things about where are we in the business cycle? What is the natural evolution of things from where we are now? But really the big story, of course, right now is changes in policy. So I'm gonna run you through several slides about likely changes in policy. Okay, I'll start with immigration, since that's been such a big part of the macro story the last couple of years. What you can see on this chart is that immigration has already fallen from its 2023 peak due to policy changes that have been made earlier this year. Of course, the president-elect during the campaign promised very large deportations of undocumented immigrants. Some people, I would say a lot of people, are actually skeptical that deportations will be as large as was promised during the election. I think that's well possible. But even with less aggressive deportations, I think we need to recognize that there may be a significant chilling effect on would-be immigrants as they hear and see stories, perhaps dramatic news about deportation, and also on the businesses that hire undocumented immigrants. Going to trade policy, of course, we've talked a lot about it this morning. I think the first thing I should say is just shout out to my PIIE colleagues. They have done such excellent work in this regard. I have a screenshot here by an important study by Warwick McGibbon and Marcus Noland and Megan Hogan, but of course there's the great work that's been done by Mary and our other colleagues. I think here it's been pretty well established that to the degree that tariffs do go up, and I can't give you numbers because we don't know what's actually going to happen, but we'll see higher inflation. We'll see higher interest rates as a result of higher inflation. We'll see lower growth. We'll see supply chain disruptions, which also impinge on growth. Then, of course, there are further effects. We've already talked about retaliation from other countries. That's a big deal. But I would also flag kind of more uncertainty in disruptions, because we are likely to see kind of variations in kind of the targets of these tariffs, and over time we'll see variation just in response to domestic pressures and international bargaining. So, it's not like we're gonna, wake up, at the end of January and find, oh, here's the new world in terms of tariffs. I think we're gonna just see a lot of kind of chaos around that. I should acknowledge that tariffs do raise revenues, and I'm gonna turn to fiscal issues in a minute, so we should recognize that to the degree that we see tariffs, there will be some revenue raised. Third big area with the new administration is deregulation. And I should say it's not just deregulation. Changing regulation, it's hard. I know this from my time in government. We have rules around what the process for changing regulation, and things get challenged in courts and so on. I should say it's not just the change in the rules of the law, it's enforcement as well. Enforcement, how strict or how lax it is a big deal. But anyway, we kind of know the sectors that will be targeted: energy production, environmental protection, permitting of infrastructure building, financial, including crypto. I would say here probably kind of the biggest effect might be via business confidence, that basically a business-friendly deregulatory agenda just signals that this administration is out to help business. I will say, on the other hand, echoing my point about tariffs, that uncertainty about what will change and whether changes will stick may stall business action. I mean, we heard about lobbying this morning in terms of tariffs. We're going to see that kind of lobbying and negotiation with deregulation as well. And I also want to point out that even though on this list, I actually, when it comes to permitting of infrastructure, I think that it could be a big deal in terms of something that does help with economic growth. The hard evidence is really lacking on whether deregulation can significantly boost GDP growth. Fourth area, fiscal policy. Okay, so here, the thing that people are most confident about is that the Republican trifecta in Washington will be extending most of those 2017 tax cuts. So how should we think about that? Well, I think, the important thing to recognize is that just maintains the current level of fiscal support. That just continues with current policy. So there's no direct effect on macroeconomic activity from that. Now, of course, more might be done in which case we might have stimulus, but I do want to kind of flag that kind of the most likely thing, directly in terms of the macroeconomy, just maintains current support. I think the bigger deal is what I'm showing you in this chart here, which is showing you the path of federal debt. I think many of you have seen variations on this graph over time. The blue line shows you CBO's baseline, which is under current law, which assumes expiration of those tax cuts. The red line is showing you my own calculations of what happens just extending those tax cuts, nothing else, and I should say not including any revenue from tariffs. But you can see that that red line, that the extending those tax cuts, it makes it a bad situation in terms of high and rising debt. It makes it even worse, particularly as you go out over time. So I think the big question here is just what happens in terms of markets and interest rates. I mean, certainly you're going to get incremental increases in interest rates from this, but I think the question when people start to kind of take these numbers on board is, you know, do we see something even more dramatic than that? Okay, so those are the big 4 areas of policy changes. What I want to do now is basically take stock of the situation. And here's where I want to come back to kind of the lesson we learned from this recent inflation surge, which is we need to be very careful about putting in place policies that risk pushing aggregate demand into territory where supply is very constrained, because that's how you end up with another burst of inflation. And kind of what I've told you today is really that there are a lot of cross currents. So on the demand side, we've got 2025, we're going to enter it with still strong fundamentals. We're going to have potential new tailwinds via confidence, via stimulus, potential new headwinds via uncertainty, via lower real income coming from tariffs, and so on. So we've got these cross currents in demand and in supply as well. We're going to have new constraints, perhaps important ones from deportations and choices for immigrants not to come to this country, supply chain disruptions from tariffs. I should acknowledge that there are possible boosts on the supply side as well. I talked about deregulation. We'll see how much we get there. But the thing I didn't talk about is AI. There is the potential for AI to kind of translate into much faster productivity growth that would kind of impact this, would expand supply. So we've got these various cross currents. I actually haven't mentioned the Federal Reserve at all. There are lots of things to say about the Fed's behavior and the Fed's likely reaction to all of this happening, but I'm going to defer all that to my colleague, David Wilcox, who will have all the answers for you on that score. But anyway, kind of just to wrap up, I think the right way to think about what's going to happen to the US economy in 2025 is really to think about scenarios. And here's where I land, which is basically 75% chance policy results in cross currents that leave the US economy largely on track for where it would go anyway. And here, this is a scenario where policy doesn't change as much as might be expected. So, why would that happen? I thought the last panel really talked a lot about that. And I have to say, I agree with Caroline that, we think about this idea of kind of market discipline as affecting the markets affecting private actors and containing their risk-taking behavior. But I think there's an argument to be made here that really kind of, and I don't think this is the way you should govern, but that the market reaction will discipline what the administration is doing. But it's a scenario where confidence remains strong, and then you get, importantly, good realizations on the supply side from AI and deregulation that avoid some of the inflationary pressures that might otherwise emerge. But then I've got 25% on basically policy changes move the US economy towards slower growth, possible stagflation. And here, either because of deliberate changes in policy or because you start to change policy and you end up with a runaway train, but you get meaningful adverse supply shocks, fiscal changes erode market confidence, inflation and interest rates pick up, momentum stalls. You get some stagflation. I'm not saying you're going to get a recession, but you certainly end up with an elevated risk of recession. So with that, that's all I have to say, and I will turn things over to my next colleague.
Thank you. and it's a great honor to be here to share my views on China's economy in 2025. And recently, maybe the most widely discussed topic in China is that there is a policy pivot, micro policy pivot. And there is a more and more popular narrative in China. That is, the Chinese economy is now at a similar stage in business cycle, just like it was in 2015. And let's first see what happened in 2015. In late 2014, the Xiamen University conducted a survey of 100 Chinese economists on the downward pressure of economic. And then the top 5 factors were as follow. The number 1, decline in real estate investment and sales. And number 2, overcapacity in manufacturing. Number 3, increased corporate debt risks. And number 4, rising local government debt risks. And number 5, insufficient external debt. And that's exactly what we are worrying about now. And then we see the statement in March 2015 by the government working report, and it said the difficulties and challenges were larger than expected, and the development must have a reasonable growth rate. And it sounds very familiar to us, what has been said yesterday. And it said implement unconventional counter-cyclical policy, and someone translate the word as extraordinary. And the central government also asked to stabilize the real estate market and the stock market. So the same problem and the same prescription. And what happened next in 2016 is that we witnessed a very strong rebound of China's economy, and we can see the nominal GDP growth rate and the PMI and the other important economic indicators recovery significantly. And so we all know that the history didn't repeat itself often. But this time the market expects, or at least hopes, it can ream. And then we summarize 3 facts what happened in 2015 to 2016. The first is that the monetary policy was proactive at that time, while the fiscal policy remained prudent. And we can see the PBOC cut policy rate on time deposit and required reserve ratio tremendously. And this was the largest rate cut in nearly 10 years. And meanwhile, the PBOC created a new monetary tool, pledged supplementary lending, PSL, which inject almost 700 billion yuan into the banking system. And in contrast, we can see that the fiscal policy remained quite prudent. The general public budget expenditure growth rate remains stable, while the government managed funds expenditure was negative throughout the 2015. And this was mainly because the land sale revenue decreased sharply in 2015. And this was exactly what happened in the past 3 years since 2022. And the second fact is that the infrastructure investment growth rate remained relatively high throughout 2015, with nearly 20% all the year, while the real estate growth rate and investment growth rate and manufacturing investment growth rate declined sharply in the same period. And we can do a very simple thought experiment. That is, if the infrastructure investment growth rate could not remain at that high level, it will be very difficult to stabilize the economy, even if we can see a recovering property market. And that's what we saw in 2018, when the infrastructure investment growth rate fall down from nearly 15% to 0. And it caused a very significant downward pressure. And the second slight effect is that the stabilization of real estate sector led the business cycle, and also the household sector was the main driver of leverage. We can see from the chart 6, the new house sales rebound in the early 2015 and turned positive in the mid 2015, 2 quarters earlier than the economic recovery, and also the house price stopped decline and turned positive in mid 2015 too, also 2 quarters earlier than the economic recovery. And then in 2016, we see that the household was the main driver of the credit expansion, especially in 2016, the household was the largest part of the margin change of the new debt issuance in 2016. And then the question is why this can happen in 2015 to 2016. And without a doubt, accommodative monetary policy played a very important role, but monetary policy is essentially a choice, an adjustable tool which can be deliberately controlled. What we are trying to find is some more fundamental reason or necessary conditions for better understanding the economic rebound at that time. And here is the first fundamental reason we want to emphasize is that the local government financial vehicles, LGFV, and real estate enterprises can raise funds from capital market normally. And in another word, what I mean is the financing channel for such entities worked quite well at that time. We can see in the chart 10, the bond issuance of LGFVs saw an explosive growth during 2014 to 2016, with about nearly 3 trillion yuan just from one single financing tool. And that is crucial for understanding why the infrastructure investment can remain at a very high level. Because in China, nearly more than half of the infrastructure investment funds comes from the LGFVs. And also we can see that the real estate enterprise debt insurance remain relatively stable at the same time. And specifically, the bond issuance peaked at this period in 2015 to 2016. And this is totally different from what we are facing now. We can see in chart 10, the red circle shows that in the past 4 quarters, the net issuance of LGFV bond was negative because of the local government finance activity was strictly regulated by the central government. And also in 2023, we can see in chart 11, the net issuance of real estate developer debt was negative too, because the financial market and institutes are worrying, maybe more and more worrying about the debt issue of real estate developers. And the second necessary condition we want to show is that the household balance sheet was relatively healthy in 2015. And we can see in chart 12, the return on assets of household exceeded the debt cost most of the time, which means it's a rational choice for household to leverage, to burden more debt. And also we can see the debt service ratio of household, the cash flow burden from the debt is relatively low, lower than 8% at that period. And the current situation is exactly the opposite. We can see that since 2022, the return on assets of household has been persistently lower than the debt cost. And it's crucial for us to understand why the household is striving to shrink their balance sheet during the past 2 years. And given all the conditions and the mechanisms we have mentioned above, even we have witnessed a policy pivot, I think the history will neither repeat nor rhyme. The most possible scenario from the point of my view is that we will see a very mild recovery in 2025 based on several logics. The first is that the contractionary impacts of fiscal policy is diminishing due to the local government debt resolution plan. And the second is that the negative effects of the property market are easing as the sharpest decline phase has passed. And the third, accommodative monetary policy is expected to remain in place. But we still have a chance for reflation as long as we can do much more than expected and indicated by the government now. First, we should significantly reduce the policy rate to bring the real rate closer to the neutral rate R-star, and less than R-star maybe is best. And second, the central government should issue additional debt to sustain reasonable growth in public sector spending. What I mean is, at least it should exceed the nominal GDP growth rate. It would be helpful. And last but not least, we need to roll out a comprehensive plan to address the debt crisis of real estate developers as soon as possible. So the developers can raise funds from the capital market normally, and the household would restore their confidence in the real estate sector, and the demand would be released gradually. And that's all I want to share. Thank you for listening.
I've had a great deal of good fortune in my life. One of the very few pieces of bad luck that I had was to be born into a family that lived in the English-speaking portion of the world. And born into a family in particular whose last name started with the 23rd letter of the alphabet. So I find myself in the accustomed position of being the last stop between you and lunch. I'll be brief, partly mindful of that fact. I do love my parents, by the way. I've spent most of my professional life thinking about monetary policy, mostly in the United States. I did have the good fortune of visiting the People's Bank of China for 5 weeks in 2010 and had the very good luck to meet some of you there. I'm going to stay in character for the next few minutes and therefore speak with you just about a few issues pertaining to monetary policy, mostly with respect to the United States, but raising a speculative thought about the comparative structure of monetary policy in the United States and in China. The FOMC, the monetary policy decision-making body of the United States, meets next week. So the first issue I'm going to discuss is a very short-term, near-term tactical question that will bear on what the Open Market Committee might decide next Wednesday. Secondly, I'll touch on an institutional threat to the way that monetary policy is conducted in the United States and mention some factors there that bear on what the incoming administration and President-elect Trump and how he might change the institutional arrangements for monetary policy in the United States. And then thirdly, I'll take advantage of being in a room where just about everybody knows more about Chinese monetary policy than I do. But I'd like to put on the table a question about how monetary policy is organized in the United States compared to in China. So those are my 3 topics. The Fed has a dual mandate. That means that it's instructed by the Congress to think about economic activity and inflation. Predominantly, economic activity lately seems to be focused on the condition of the labor market and pesky question is we keep getting really strong jobs numbers. For example, in the most recent labor market report, we were told by the Bureau of Labor Statistics that 227,000 jobs had been added in November. And that's a number that exceeds most conventional estimates of the sustainable pace of job creation in the United States. And so the question arises, does the Open Market Committee still have more work to do in terms of cooling the labor market to get the labor market into a sustainable position? So yes, I have an affiliation with Peterson. My other affiliation is with Bloomberg. For Bloomberg, yesterday I posted a piece where I dug into some of this, and I'm going to show you two charts from my Bloomberg piece from yesterday. This one is adapted from a paper that David Reifschneider posted on the Peterson website. I think it's a really stunning chart. What I've done here is collected 7 key indicators of labor market pressure. It's a whole range of indicators. It's sort of a grab bag. What the pattern is that I want you to see is that pre-COVID, there really wasn't a hair's breadth of difference among these indicators. Nobody even really, frankly, bothered to debate which was the best one for purposes of monetary policy analysis or macro modeling. By default, most macro modelers simply use the unemployment rate as a perfectly fine measure. What happened with COVID is stunning. These indicators diverged wildly. Inflation emerged in a very surprising degree, surprising especially, frankly, for those of us who focused mostly on the unemployment rate, because what you can see in the chart is the unemployment rate spiked to a level that had not been seen in the United States since the Great Depression, and that rate, by the admission of the BLS, was probably 3 percentage points or so too low because of some measurement technicalities that I won't go into. So it looked for a while like the US economy was in catastrophically weak condition. Good reason not to be concerned, particularly concerned about inflation. Even when the economy came roaring back, it's almost impossible to see, but the unemployment rate indicator is the purple line. Even when the US economy came roaring back, that indicator didn't point to a whole lot of overheating. There were others that pointed to much more overheating. And so then there became a very vigorous debate about which was the best indicator. The thing that's really interesting is that debate, I'm predicting, is going to just wither away, because almost all of these indicators now have converged back to send the same signal. And what is that signal? That signal is that the labor market has cooled over the past 2 years. It is continuing gently to cool now, and its position is that it's in a slightly cooler condition today than it was on the eve of the pandemic. The US economy was basically in a perfect sweet spot on the eve of the pandemic. The Open Market Committee probably doesn't need to see any further cooling. So the punchline from my Bloomberg article was, as far as the labor market is concerned, real activity, the Open Market Committee has done enough work in cooling conditions down. Inflation is a more pesky matter, as Karen suggested in her comments. But on one leg of the mandate anyway, the door is wide open to another 25 basis point cut next Wednesday. How do you reconcile, I'll be quite brief with this graph, how do you reconcile those strong jobs numbers that I mentioned, 227,000 last month, with the idea that the labor market is cooling? The answer is, well, the thermostat is, if I may put it this way, the thermostat is just on a different setting, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. I can't tell you, what is that? That's about 20 degrees centigrade. That doesn't mean what it used to mean. The comfortable temperature of jobs at the moment seems to be much higher, possibly because we're still absorbing a lot of immigrants, and that might simply be boosting the number of jobs that need to be added each month in order to keep labor market conditions steady. So my recommendation, a little pretentious in a Bloomberg piece to offer advice to the Open Market Committee, but that's what I did. Set those old notions aside of what the comfortable temperature of job creation is. I'm stunned every time I look at this chart, but the estimates, imprecise as they are, suggest that we might need to be creating as many as 400,000 jobs per month simply in order to hold labor market conditions constant. I'm not terribly confident of that, as indicated by the wide gray area, which shows you the span of possible estimates. What I am confident is that the policymakers shouldn't let those strong job numbers inhibit them from cutting interest rates one more step next week. Okay, so for those of us who are proud alums of the central bank, this is a very fraught and nervous time. I have to say, none of this discussion will make any sense to you whatsoever if you don't adopt the view that an independent central bank is the way we do things in the United States. And so therefore, potential attacks on the independence of the central bank are a source of stress, anxiety, waking up in the middle of the night, that sort of thing. How could President-elect Trump bend the Federal Reserve more to its will? It seems to me there are three main ways that he could do that. And I use a metaphor having to do with a building. The incoming president could simply walk in through the front door of the building. How could he do that? He could do that by exercising the conventional power that is available to any president to appoint new members to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. These appointments are scheduled to come open once every 2 years, January of every even-numbered year. The first such appointment that will be available to President Trump is in January of 2026. The next will be in January 2028. And so the president could, as I say, by totally conventional means, appoint people more to his policy liking to the Federal Reserve Board. More additional appointments would come open because members of the Board of Governors are not under any sort of legal or moral obligation to serve out the full entirety of their 14-year term. So 2 is the minimum, but that's the most conventional way that President Trump could shift the conduct of monetary policy in the United States. A second, a level 2 of seriousness relies on a following strange oddity in the US system. According to the law, the president designates the chair and there are 2 vice chairs, designates those positions from among the members of the Board of Governors. So Chair Powell, for example, actually has 2 confirmed positions, not just 1. He is a member of the Board of Governors, and then he has this additional designation as chair of the Federal Reserve Board. And so it's conceivable that a president, this has never been tried before, but the incoming president could attempt to demote Chair Powell from that supercharged designation as chair of the Federal Reserve down a rank to just an ordinary member of the Board of Governors. There's some interesting legal history, and for those of you who want to hear a little story, just talk to me afterwards. It involves a poor guy named Humphrey who died in the course of his litigation. But his executor carried on the legal battle in 1935, and it makes for kind of an interesting little anecdote about US legal history. This would certainly be challenged in court if President Trump attempted this act of demotion. It would be much more difficult for him to actually remove somebody from the Board of Governors, and to the point that's now been made several times, I think financial markets would react quite adversely to that. It would set up a period of profound uncertainty, and it does seem to be the case that President-elect Trump pays attention to at least one external factor, and that is the stock market. And so that probably would provide some restraint. The third, level 3, and the most serious, is a legal theory that has gained some traction among conservative legal scholars. It's called unitary executive theory. And this relies on a reading of the US Constitution in Article 2 that says the executive power of the federal government shall reside in the president. That's all it says. There is no mention in the Constitution of this concept of an independent agency. And so this theory holds, hey, wait a minute, a plain language reading of the Constitution suggests independent agencies may not conform to our legal structure. And so this idea would abolish the concept of an independent central bank and of a whole bunch of other independent agencies too, by the way. And in that case, interest rate setting behavior and all other dimensions of monetary policy would then flow through the office of the president. And so that would be a quite profound change. Now, having thought about all of this for quite a while, quite intensively, it raises in my mind an interesting question. There is, if I may use it this way, there's kind of a almost religious theology in the United States that an independent central bank is a good thing. And people like me get all nervous and our blood pressure goes up and sweat glands activate when there are threats to central bank independence. When I had the privilege of traveling to Beijing and being having an office at the PBOC, perfectly apparent that the monetary policy is in no way, shape, or form. There is no pretense of an independent central bank in China, and the system works very well. And in fact, my guess is that from a Chinese perspective, it must be very puzzling. What the heck? Why bother with an independent monetary policy since it's there, since that makes it impossible structure that impedes the ability for the government to integrate monetary policy decision-making in a strategic manner with all the other tools in the policymaking toolbox. Wouldn't it be more efficient? Well, there's one problem in the US that this whole central bank independence thing is meant to solve, and that's what's referred to as a time inconsistency problem. In the US, if you put your foot on the monetary gas pedal and implement a more accommodative monetary policy, you get the benefit first and the cost later. You get the faster growth. You get the lower unemployment early. And elected officials in the US have quite a short time horizon. In the case of presidents, it's 4 years and then they're either up for re-election or out of office. But even if they're going to be out of office, they'll be quite interested that a member of their party face good chances for election so that the White House won't change hands. And so the way in the US that's been devised for dealing with this problem is to take that temptation out of the hands of elected officials and set it aside to an independent central bank. In China, the executive power has a very long horizon. And so as best as I can tell, there is no temptation to exploit this time in inconsistency. I would be very interested in hearing from those of you who is, like I say, almost everybody in the room knows more about monetary policy than I do, about whether this seems like a plausible explanation for this profoundly different method of organization. As I say here, the systems are very different. Monetary policy seems, on the whole, to work quite well in both countries. The difference in the time horizon of the executive is the only explanation that I've been able to come up with. With that, I've already previewed all of this, and so with that, we are one step closer to lunch. I say as a W.
Fantastic. Since we don't have much time for discussion, I'll just ask each of you one question I had in mind. I'll go in order from Dr. Gao to David. Dr. Gao, you made some very important remarks about China's growth in the past several years a week ago, which generated a lot of discussion in China and here in the US too. Given what you have said, where do you see China's growth, potential growth actually, in the next few years? How we should think about whether China can grow 5% or 3%, or where the potential growth should be, given the current conditions in China? And Karen, I was a little bit surprised by your scenario. You said 75% on track, 25% stagflation. I would have thought that there may be some risk of overheating, given why you're not mentioning that possibility. Why that's not in your scenario analysis? And Zhu He, you said China should cut interest to R-star or even below R-star. So what are we talking about? Where is R-star in China right now, and how much China needs to cut? Give me a number so we have an idea where the policy should be. And David, I guess one question is, you didn't mention in your presentation, is everybody tried to ask Chairman Powell how fiscal policy in the U.S. would affect monetary policy. I guess you have more liberty to discuss that. This is also related to this your comparison between Chinese model and U.S. model. Probably you can say a few words on how the Fed should think about fiscal policy, particularly current fiscal policy right now. So I'll stop here, and Dr. Gao.
It's a very tough question because we do not know the true number of China's real growth figure and maybe some other numbers. And we have to trust and rely on the official figures, even though many people speculate and doubt that after the pandemic, those numbers may not be so accurate. And my own speculation is that in the past 2 to 3 years, the real number on average might be around 2%, even though the official number is close to 5%. And if my speculation is correct, I think it might be more reasonable to expect the growth rate between 3 to 4% in the years to come for next 3 to 5 years. But we don't know. And I think the official number will always be around 5%.
Okay, very comforting.
Yeah, so your question was about overheating and whether I'm building that into my scenarios. And yeah, so I should clarify, the second scenario that I talked about, I think you can think about that as a potential overheating dynamic. When I think about overheating, there's a demand component of that, but there's a supply. It's really a story about demand crashing up against supply. And I think between a surge in confidence, at least in the business community, possible buying ahead of tariffs, pull ahead your purchases before the tariffs come on, fiscal stimulus, if Congress goes above and beyond extending those tax cuts, those will all push up demand. And on the supply side, remember, supply conditions are already getting less favorable because we already have this drop in immigration. We already have labor force participation. I don't know that it has the capacity to get much higher than where it is now. And then you add on top of that the possibility of significant deportations, which lower our labor supply. And kind of supply chain problems or disruptions that come from the imposition of tariffs on and the effects of higher intermediate good prices on producers. You could be talking about some real supply constraints. And, the people who are optimistic about the president's policies, they see, well, this deregulatory agenda that will unleash a lot of new supply. And, people, it's anyone's guess about how much we'll get out of AI. But I would say the second scenario really is one in which you start to see more inflation, you start to, higher interest rates, a loss of momentum, and it really is partially an overheating story. So I think that is a real possibility. I just think it's a question of how extreme it gets.
Yeah, actually, we have done some estimation of the R-star in China during the past several years, and we use some kind of economic model and panel data across countries. And the result was quite interesting. What we found is that recent year, especially since 2022, the R-star in China maybe was negative, maybe minus 0.5 to -1%. And given the short-term policy rate was only 1.5% of the DR. So even if we can cut policy rate up to 50 to 100 bips, it may not be sufficient to drive the R towards the R-star. But I think if we can do such kind of monetary policy stimulus, it will be helpful for the inflation expectation. And the inflation expectation will go up, and the two force will drive the R to the R-star, and that's my answer.
So you asked about how the Fed will take account of fiscal policy and conducting monetary policy. It's a particularly important question right at the moment because there's likely to be quite an abrupt change in fiscal policy. The risk of sounding like I'm doing another advertisement for Bloomberg, I actually put a piece up on the terminal last week that discusses this, so I'll try to give you the 5-sentence summary. Sentence one, it's complicated. What they do is they try to act like Bayesian decision makers. By that I mean they take probabilities into account and they take risks into account. For actions that are likely to happen and that are well understood, they will absolutely build that into their assessment of the economic outlook, and they'll write down in the famous dot plot, for example, they'll write down interest rates that conform to that judgment about what fiscal policy is likely to be. And the poster child, the case study for this, is a factor that Karen mentioned, which is the extension of the 2017 tax cuts. Everybody and their cousin expects those tax cuts to be extended. And so there's not a single member of the Open Market Committee, I'm wagering, that hasn't built that into their thinking about the outlook. There's a second category of events that's a little more interesting analytically, and those are events that are reasonably likely to occur, but where the details are quite vague. I was in the position of confronting that situation in 2016 because I was at that time staff director and oversaw the construction of the staff economic forecast at the Federal Reserve Board. What we did at that time was I actually had occasion to go back and read the transcript from the 2016 December FOMC meeting. It's embarrassing to see how disjointed my syntax is when it's written out. But we called it a plug. And a plug was meant to be a word for, this is just a rough placeholder. We don't really know what the contours will be, but we just we jammed in there a personal income tax cut equal to 1% of GDP. Why did we do that? We did that because we thought that something was better than nothing. We wanted to be somewhere in the center part of the probability distribution. And if we didn't put anything in for a coming fiscal expansion, all the probability mass would have been on one side because it was very apparent that the incoming Trump administration was going to either cut taxes, increase spending, or both. We made adjustments to that over the course of the coming year because it took a year for that legislation to be enacted, but we did something. Now, our ability, the last thing I'll mention, actually two things. Our ability to do that was greatly enhanced by an odd institutional feature, which is that although policymaker forecasts are revealed in real time 4 times a year at the time of Chair Powell's press conference, the staff forecast is not revealed for 5 years. And I was acutely aware of how greatly my ability to assist policymakers in their deliberations would have been impaired if our staff forecast had been revealed in real time, because we, unlike the policymakers, were very explicit about what the underlying assumptions were, about what we thought the multipliers would be, and so forth and so on. So it would be absolutely impossible right now, for example, for the staff to say, well, we assumed 60% tariffs on China. That would subject them to intense public criticism, and so therefore their ability to help policymakers would be degraded greatly. The last category is low-risk events, but not impossible. And those we handled in the staff forecast by doing alternative simulations using our macro models. We gave that to committee members for their consideration. Perhaps some of them, Governor Ju might say, oh, I like simulation number 2, and Governor Dinan might say, I like simulation number 4. But those were ones where even the more adventurous staff was not willing to build it in to our baseline. My guess is that's probably what's going on right now with some other elements of the Trump economic package, like deportations and tariffs and so forth. As some clarity emerges, they'll build those into the baseline forecast, but maybe not quite yet.
I have to follow up with one question, which I think is important. I think in the last trade war, I think the staff recommended that the Fed see through the tariff increase. It's going to be one-off impact on inflation. Don't worry about that. Now, would you recommend the same if Trump does what he said he's going to do?
It's too bad Steve Kamen is not here. He's probably across the street at the American Enterprise Institute. He was at that time division director of the international division, and so it's his name that appears in the transcript answering that question. My own answer to that is the context has changed dramatically since then, from then to now. In 2016, we were still in an extended period of extraordinary inflation performance, where, if anything, inflation was somewhat to the annoyance of the Open Market Committee, running a little too low, about half a percentage point below their target. The confidence of the public in the Fed's ability to deliver price stability was rock solid. And that confidence has, I think, been severely eroded today. So my guess is that, and here I'm completely speculating, but my guess is that my advice, frankly, would be policymakers should be much more cautious today to safeguard the stability of longer-term inflation expectations against a possibility of erosion that might be generated. All of us economists could say, oh, that's a price level shift. That's not an ongoing inflationary process. To people who go to the local store and they buy one item that's up 10% this week, and they go back to a different store and buy a different item that's up 20% the following week, that's going to look a lot like inflation. And so I think the threat to inflation expectations would be much more severe now.
Yeah, Karen.
I'm going to follow up with just two very quick points. And one is, I think, an important lesson in the last few years that economists have kind of relearned is just how unpopular increases in the price level are, which then can, it has political and social repercussions. I'll leave that one there. But that surely is on people's minds. I will say the other thing is just gauging. We have a lot of things changing at once, and we won't be sitting in a perfect world where we'll be able to say, oh, this price increase is coming from this factor, and this one is reflecting a general overheating, which we can, in fact, do something about. And in the paper I have coming up, we talk a lot about this. If you're sitting there in 2021 and you're hearing all these stories about used cars and semiconductors, how do you know that it's not these special stories that you should look through, and instead it's a general overheating that you really can and should do something about. And I think that will be a challenge.
And my last question will to Dr. Gao and Zhu He. We cannot conclude this discussion without talking about China's property sector. How do you see the property sector in 2025? Would Chinese government be able to stop the decline? Would the market stabilize or something else? Zhu He first, then we'll have Gao Shanwen say the last words.
Okay. Well, I will be very, very short. I heard some kind of view. It's not from me, but I agree with that. They told me from the capital market that the whole market is waiting for the whatever it takes time. And this time maybe not the time that the market expected. That's all.
Okay.
I think the government has done a lot to stabilize the sector. However, what we are experiencing is a collapse of a shadow financial system. Therefore, even though it might be possible to stabilize the sales, however, I think the developers will continue to deleverage. And in this sense, it will still be a big drag factor for the macroeconomy overall.
I think we are running out of time. Just in case anybody in the audience want to have a quick question or two. Anyone? Okay, Tianlei, you can.
I have a question for Dr. Gao and Dr. Zhu, and probably also Dr. Guo as well. So we just saw the readout of the Central Economic Work Conference came out this morning, and there was some quite positive statements in terms of macro policy next year. But do you worry that the top leaders may be over-talking and the lower-level bureaucrats may be under-delivering?
No, this is really to Zhu He and Gao Shanwen. Let Zhu He go first, and we'll.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what will happen now. To be honest, I didn't have very specific idea about this question, but just like what I have said, it may not be where it takes time.
I think the government has two challenges. And the most important and structural challenge is to put in place a sound framework to regulate the shadow fiscal system and the shadow financial institutions. As far as this reform can be established, the government can be confident to stimulate the economy without the worry that the debt level may go up too far. However, I do not think the government has already a systematic solution on how to put in place such a regulatory framework. Therefore, their efforts to stimulate the economy will be very opportunistic. And in the end, I do not think they can be very confident to deliver what they have promised, just as what they did in past year or even 2 years earlier.
Okay, I think both of them essentially gave the same answer, but frame it differently. I think that's very good. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the panelists. It's really good discussion. Thank you all.